All right. During orientation at the beginning of the year, we played a game, Two Truths and a Lie. Here is a modified version of my Two Truths and a Lie. I am a Jew. My grandfather used to dress up as Santa Claus for Christmas. I am really good at basketball. I may not have played a lot of bookstore this year, but I think it's safe to say you all know which is my lie. But I think it's worth noting that I am comfortable telling you that I am a Jew. I am a Jewish person in America, and I have always been comfortable with that fact. I've always felt safe being Jewish. I've never been afraid of who I was. My grandparents, on the other hand, were not lucky enough to have that experience. And so today I'm going to tell you the story of my father's parents. These are my grandmother Helene's parents, David and Esther Piernikaz. This is my grandmother Helene when she was about 20, kind of towards the end of this story. Helene was born in Kolo, Poland in 1923. Kolo was a very small town near the German border. Helene's father and her grandfather before him owned a mill in town, so they were fairly well-to-do. Her parents would travel a lot. She had a nanny, and her older sister had a nanny before her. Her older sister, Suava, was just a few years older than her and was perfect, according to Helene. So Helene didn't try to compete with her older sister in school. She became more of a social girl instead. She had lots of friends. She was in high school. And for the most part, life was pretty comfortable for Helene and her family in this small town in Poland. This is my grandfather Bernard's family. This is him in the middle, and his parents Moshe and Dorothy, or Dora. Bernard was born in 1921 in Warsaw, Poland. This is him at about 20 years old. And he was an only child until the age of 15 when his younger brother Lolek was born. Bernard's father owned a movie theater in the city. He was athletic. He would go to the movies. Again, life was pretty comfortable for both of my grandparents in Poland before the war. And I'm going to be telling you their story today, but I also wanted them to be able to tell part of their story today. So in 1996, both of them were interviewed for the USC, University of Southern California Shoah Project. It was a project that interviewed Holocaust survivors to hear their stories. So we'll be seeing some clips from those interviews today. But on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And that's really when the war began for both of them. And my grandmother said that day, September 1st, was the first day she realized that, at least in the eyes of the people around her, she was not a Pole, she was a Jew. Before this point, she had always felt like she was just part of the community, just like everyone else. But immediately to the people around her and her family, they were different. Food became scarce. You had to wait in line in their small town to get food, and Jews were not allowed to wait in line. And the neighbors were very happy to point out who the Jews were and say, well, you're not supposed to be in this line. They lived in a very small town. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew who the Jews were in this town. So life became very scary for Helene and her family. At one point, Helene's father was arrested. He was beaten up in jail and then let go in the morning, and they immediately left for Warsaw. They felt in a big city, there was more anonymity, they might be safer. Helene and Bernard both did not look Jewish. Blonde hair, blue eyes. It was easier to kind of pass as not Jewish if there weren't people around who already knew who you were. So Helene and her family moved into Warsaw in 1940, or late 1939, early 1940, and they ended up moving into the apartment building next door to Bernard. Helene's family had a piano in the apartment. Bernard would come visit to look at the piano, to claim he was thinking about buying it, but we all know that's not what was going on. So they started dating, and Bernard, the city boy, wanted to show off his city to Helene, the country girl. So they would take off their armbands. By this point, they had to wear something to mark that they were Jews, but they would take them off. They would take the train around the city and go see the sights. At least in the beginning, things were not too difficult. But in fall of 1940, all of the Jews were required to move into the Warsaw Ghetto. And the ghetto was a small area of the city. All of the non-Jews moved out, all of the Jews moved in. It was about 1.3 square miles at its largest, and it held about 400,000 people. That's roughly the population of the city of New Orleans in a space about the size of Lumiere's campus. Things were incredibly crowded. Life was very hard. And in November of 1940, the Germans closed the ghetto. They had built a wall around the ghetto, barbed wire on top, guards at all the entrances, and it became very difficult to move around both in and out of the ghetto and within the ghetto. So here is Bernard talking about conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Hunger, 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 and hunger. Hunger by the young people, hunger by the old people, hunger by every number of any people who were before the war members of society suddenly couldn't find themselves. But the rest of the society was starving, slowly starving to death. When you go on the street, you saw kids between 9, 14, or 18 with bellies swollen who could not move from this corner to the other corner, waiting for the money for a piece of bread or something. Those conditions were very bad, very inhuman. And when you have something like this, it hardens you because you see it daily, and you don't see any, and you just want to survive. You want to get away from this. And this is how we lived till 1943.
So from fall of 1940 until about 1942, 1943, Bernard worked as a sanitation worker. He would go and disinfect apartments and hospital rooms after people had had typhus. Disease was rampant in the ghetto, lots of hungry people in very close proximity. Helene's father also worked. He had run a mill at home, and so he ran a mill in the ghetto for a clothing factory. And since both of them worked, they got a piece of paper that gave them some protection. They were able to travel around in the ghetto a little more easily. They got a little bit more money for food. But Helene and her mother, and Bernard's mother and younger brother were not working, so things were more dangerous for them. In July of 1942, what Helene called the actions began. They began deporting Jews from the ghetto. In the beginning, they told people, we'll be sending you out east. There'll be fresh air, more room. We'll give you bread and marmalade for the journey. And people volunteered. But very quickly, people realized that wherever the trains were going, it's not what they claimed. The trains were coming back empty much too quickly to be going anywhere far away. So then they began forced deportations. They removed approximately 10,000 people a day from the ghetto. They would go building by building, get everyone out of the building, walk them down to the train station, and send them off in the trains. So that began in July of 1942. In August of 1942, they began moving the borders of the ghetto in. There were less people. They didn't want to have them taking up as much space. And so in August of 1942, they came to the building where Helene and her family lived, saying this building is no longer going to be in the ghetto. You have to move somewhere else. Helene's father was at work. She and her mother were home. Her mother had MS, multiple sclerosis. She looked healthy, but by this point she had a lot of difficulty walking. And so Helene is going to tell us about the day that her mother died.
But my mother and I were in this house on Ogrodova, on the fourth floor, and the reason I'm telling you that, because there was a balcony. It was an August, most beautiful day, at least that's the way I remember. The sun was shining, and my mother and I were alone in this apartment. And then I kept hearing them coming, because from house to house they were going. And this probably was one of the scariest moments of my life. And they came to the yard, I wanted to say, but the downstairs at the building. And they stood at this area and they were screaming and calling everybody out and everybody out. And people were going down. And we didn't, because my mother couldn't walk. And I wasn't going to leave her. So we stayed. And hoping against hope that they will not come into that apartment. Well, after they get everybody down, then they were going from from apartment to apartment checking. And
Who
they
is
came.
they? They.
They were the Lithuanian soldiers. They were not Germans because they spoke no German. They came to our apartment. You see, many of the other people, like Lithuanian, Latvish, and Ukrainians, they were helping and they were doing a lot of wonderful work for them and doing it with great pleasure. So those men came in, they were in uniform, and I was trying to explain to them in German, because I did learn German in high school, that my mother cannot walk. But, she looked healthy. She sat there at the table. And they pulled me out of the room, and then I heard a shot, and they pulled me downstairs. And at that point, I really didn't care much. I knew she was shot. And they took us all in the group to the Umschlagplatz. We walked and walked and walked. When we got to the Umschlagplatz, which I am telling you is the train station, my cousin, whom I told you was this policeman, have watched this, all that, and he saw me there. And somehow he got me out. I don't remember, but we walked through some Polish areas, and he got me out.
At this point, Helene and her father moved deeper into the ghetto, but now it was very dangerous to travel around if you didn't have one of these papers that said you were working. So remember, Bernard, Helene's father, both have papers. Helene did not. So in the new building, she and all the other people who didn't have these papers would hide in the cellar every day, just in case the Germans came to clear out their building. In the fall of 1942, Helene and Bernard decided to get married, but Helene was still too afraid to travel in the ghetto, so Bernard got married without her. She was married by proxy. He went to a rabbi, they found some witnesses on the street, and he came back with a marriage license. A few months later, it was a little safer to travel around, so they did get married in person with her father and his parents present. But even once they were married, they continued to live with their own families. They were a new relationship. They didn't know each other that well, and their families were very important to them, especially in these dangerous times. So Bernard continued to live with his parents and younger brother. Helene continued to live with her father, and they lived in different parts of the ghetto, so it was difficult to see each other because travel between the different parts of the ghetto was becoming more and more difficult. In 1943, the deportations stopped for a few months. Things calmed down a little, but that was the beginning of the resistance in the ghetto. The resistance was organizing. And on April 19th, 1949, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began. The Germans came back to try to deport more people, and the Jews began to fight. They refused to go. That night, Bernard had come to visit Helene, and once he was at their apartment, he couldn't get back to his family. It was too dangerous to travel across the ghetto. But that night, Helene and Bernard and her father decided to escape through the sewers. There was an opening to the sewers in the ghetto, and then the Polish underground would pay Poles outside of the ghetto to use their basements to come back out of the sewers. So they decided, the three of them, to escape through the sewers.
Now, when I was visiting my...
No.
I tell you, those sewers of Warsaw were not those kind of sewers that you see in the movies here. They were, first of all, you had to go down and be on your all four, and it was a lot of water, and it was dark, and it was narrow, and the people who were leading us were Polish underground, I guess. They were the ones who was getting the money.
Were they
must have
Jews?
been, no, Poles. And there must have been maybe 20 of us. And we were walking in single file because of the fact that it was a very narrow and a lot of water. And I remember having in a bag a pair of shoes that I was holding, trying to keep, dry. And we were going in a very slow pace. And from the ghetto, from this Novolipki that we were at, or Novolipi, I don't know, to the area that the ghetto was ending, which I think was somewhere on Smocha. They have now the opening to the ghetto there, They have this opening that the sewer was coming out. They have some kind of a monument there in Warsaw. But anyway, it was quite a long distance. So we were walking, and we were walking on all fours, and at one point my father fainted. Bernard was in back of him, and I was in front of him. And when he fainted, Bernard held him, and it was very hard because the people had to pass by us. Now, Mr. Binder, this is the Jew friend of ours, came back and he said to me, look, I said we're staying with with my father. He said, I promise you the people will come back for you. And I said, fine. So the three of us were sitting in that sewer, and till today there was another of those miracles, because no way did they have to come back. I mean, the money was given to them already. And why would they come back for us? But anyway, we evidently hoped. The three of us were sitting in three different places. It was dark like hell. The rats were running around. And then we're hearing after a while up in on the street, cars and people walking and horses, The day started. This was at night.
Was there sewage in this water?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. And that's why there were rats. We're talking about the first day of Passover, which was either 18 or 19 of April. When we were coming out through that sewer. They came for us, which is a total miracle when I think of it. One of many. And they took us out. They brought for that this kind of like a sled, They used to bring that is how they used to bring flour to the mill, That's why the sewer was open, because that's how they knew
How long
it.
did you sit there?
I don't know, hours. To me, it sounded like all the time, but like a lifetime. But probably a couple of hours at least, because they had to go out and come back. As I tell you, that they came back, it was one of the greatest miracles of the year.
Once Helene and Bernard and her father were out of the ghetto, Helene and Bernard had false papers with a false name, and so they paid to live with a Polish woman outside the ghetto. Helene's father was too afraid to have false papers, and so he was hidden in an apartment of a woman named Martha. 4 Jews total lived in this apartment with her, but when she went to work every day, the apartment was supposed to be empty, so they had to be completely silent. If they moved around, they had to crawl on the floor so the neighbors wouldn't see through the windows. At this point, a lot of people in Warsaw were looking out for Jews, either to extort them, to blackmail them, or to turn them in. And so it was very dangerous, even in hiding, to not get caught by the neighbors in the building. Bernard, remember, was from Warsaw, and at this point he was very afraid to go out in the city. He was afraid someone from his life before the war might recognize him as a Jew and turn him in. So he also stayed indoors most of the time. But Helene, from the small town, was much more comfortable, relatively, moving about. It was a change from the beginning, when Helene's family in the small town was in more danger because everyone knew them. Now she was the one who had the anonymity. So she would go and visit her father.
Now, when I was visiting my dad, I had to go on a streetcar, and I had to go around the ghetto, which was burning. And I must tell you that these people on the streetcar, some of them mothers with little children, would say, look at the damn Jews, because of them the ghetto our city is burning. I have not had one word of sympathy. I tell you, it was the most incredible experience for me, because here I lived in a country that I always felt quite comfortable in. And yet it was, they hated us, and I never realized this. And I'm sure this is not true of everybody. It was just my experience.
Warsaw continued to be a very dangerous place for them to live. At one point, Helene and Bernard were followed home. The police came, took them to jail overnight, and made them give up all of their jewelry and money to get out. And the police told them, if we catch you again, we'll give you to the Gestapo. So they decided it was time to leave. Helene knew someone from the ghetto who could get false papers and transport papers to go to Vienna as Polish workers. But even that was dangerous. The train station was filled with police, with people looking for Jews who were trying to escape to try and catch them. But they managed to get on the train, they managed to get across the border, and they went to Vienna. So in 1943, summer of 1943, they moved to Vienna, and that's where they stayed through the end of the war. They worked in a small motor factory, winding motors for bakeries and butcheries. They were given an apartment, or a room in an apartment with a very Christian woman. And even then, things were safer, things were better, but they were always afraid that someone would catch them, would recognize that their papers were false. They were especially afraid of the other Poles who worked in the factory who said they could smell out a Jew. But at the same time, they were being paid. They worked 55 hours a week in this factory. They got extra rations for working so many hours. So they were able to travel around the countryside, much like Helene's parents had done earlier. In April of 1945, the Russians came and liberated Vienna, and the war was over. And all of a sudden, these people who had lived for years, terrified that anyone would know they are a Jew, were asked to register to prove they had survived so any other family and friends would be able to find them. So they went and they registered, and they started to find out what had happened to their families. So Bernard had left his parents and his younger brother behind in the ghetto the night of the uprising.
My parents were the last message that I got through my cousin is that I went in Majdanek. They were up when the starting expulsion of the Jews from Warsaw Ghetto started. They started in July of 1942 and took them 6 months to clean out the ghetto. The remnants of the ghetto stayed till 1943, and then the uprising started. The Jews said, you kill us, but we are not moving. So the Germans had to put fire in every building in Warsaw and burn it out, and then the Jews, some would escape to the different bunkers, some would give up. Those who gave up were sent to Majdanek, and then they went to the oven. And I got people who survived, and they said my father and my brother were in Majdanek. And of course you knew that the young kids were first to die, and the grown-ups, so they were first to die.
Bernard's brother was 6 years old. This is the last picture Helene has of her family all together. Her mother, on your right, had died in 1942. Her father, the next in the picture, died in 1943 while in hiding in Warsaw. Her sister is the one in the middle of the picture. She was actually the first to be killed. She and her husband, sitting next to her, had moved to the eastern part of Poland. He was working, translating for Russians. And while she was alone at home, the Germans came and rounded up all the Jews in the village, took them to the cemetery, and shot them. Helene, on the right, is the only member of her immediate family to survive, just like Bernard was the only member of his immediate family to survive. They were left with each other, a handful of cousins and distant relatives, and the guilt of being the ones to survive. It was very difficult for them. It took a little while to hit. In the beginning, they were just happy to have survived, but over time, it was very difficult for them, especially around holidays, to live with what had happened to their families. In 1945, after the war was over, they both went back to Poland a few times, Bernard to Warsaw, Helene to Kolo. And on Helene's last trip to Kolo, she went. Some of her friends, especially from high school, were very glad to see her, to see that she had made it. Some of her parents' friends were happy she was alive. But she went to a judge, a friend of her father's, to ask about the mill that they'd had before, to see about maybe getting it back. And he said, "Our people don't get it, and you want to get it?" And she said, "All my life, I thought I was our people." In 1947, they came to the United States. Helene had an uncle in Kentucky. They came to the US, later moved to Chicago, had 3 boys, and our family continued. But they always had to live with what had happened to them simply because of who they are. They were never quite comfortable. They were always afraid that it could happen again, that no matter how much you felt like you were part of the community, people might turn on you. So I hope for all of you that that never happens to you, that you are always comfortable being who you are, that you feel safe, that you feel able to share yourself with other people. But what I am asking of you, and I am challenging you to do today, is to never make someone else feel uncomfortable because of who they are. Don't make people feel unsafe being who they are. It's easy to fall into stereotypes and prejudice, but it is important to see each person as an individual who has the right to be whoever they are without being judged or being persecuted. So go today and try and build a community, build a world where everyone can be themselves and no one has to be afraid. Thank you.